Right. Good morning, everybody. I hope I am audible as well. My name is Archit Kansal, and I'm part of the Startup Partnerships team at SwissNext India. SwissNext India operates out of Bangalore and is a part of SERI, which is the State Secretariat for Education, Research, and Innovation. SERI is the Swiss counterpart of India's DST and operates as an internal ministry in Switzerland. And in order to anchor internationalization of Swiss startups and Swiss innovation, SERI has teamed up with EDA, which is the Embassy of Switzerland, to create the SwissNext network. SwissNext is a network across 5 locations: San Francisco, Boston, Shanghai, Rio, and Bangalore. And we all do the same thing. We receive Swiss research and innovation in our respective economies and catalyze their internationalization. So right from ideation stage, startups have a number of challenges in front of them: product market fit, pivoting strategies, tangling with weekly sales targets, hiring the right fit, raising funds, and so much more. All of these are non-negotiable priorities for startups. But then where does governance fit in all of this? Should it be a top priority for startups? When should we actually focus on it? And most importantly, what is governance? These are some of the questions that we'll try to shed some light on today. I'm sure that you all have heard of the case of Wirecard, a German payment processor and financial services provider that is in the news these days. WeWork, Theranos, they are all very good examples of startups that grew at an unprecedented rate, only to fall down due to lack of proper governance procedures. Now I would like to introduce our panelists who will help us answer some of these questions and provide their valuable insights on startup governance. Firstly, Ms. Poini Bhatt. She is a qualified legal and compliance professional turned to technology business incubation by chance, helping entrepreneurs for over a decade. She has an experience of 3 decades in the industry and academia. She is a founding member of SIGN, the technology business incubator at IIT Bombay, and has been managing the incubator since 2004. She's a member of several Indian government committees on innovation, entrepreneurship, and incubation, and also a member on the boards of several incubators in India. Welcome, Poini. Thank you for being here. Next is Mr. Michael Hilp. He's an expert at InnoSpace and is the founder and CEO of DBP Group, serves on various boards and teaches strategy, entrepreneurship, and corporate governance at universities in Asia and Europe. He's a titular professor at the University of Fribourg and holds a PhD from the University of Sungan. He was a visiting fellow at INSEAD and Harvard University and completed executive education programs at IMD, INSEAD, HBS, and MIT. Welcome, Michael. I hope you can hear me as well.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. So in this webinar, what we'll intend to do is have a moderated discussion between the panelists on the importance of startups, importance of governance in startups, my mistake. We'll keep aside 15 minutes at the end to tackle any questions you may have for our panelists. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to post any questions. And whilst posting it, please also let us know who would you like the question to be directed to, right? So with that, let us delve straight right in. Govind, can you switch to the next slide, please? Thank you. So firstly, Michael, can you help us understand what exactly is startup governance and why is it relevant to any startup?
Great. Many thanks, Archit, for the very kind introduction. And indeed, I also strongly believe that governance of startups is a key topic, which not only determines survival of companies, but also success or successful growth of companies. Now, so what is governance? We usually take a very broad perspective and define any mechanism, any processes, any instrument in place at a startup, which helps to direct and control the business as it grows. Now, governance, I would say it's a key success factor of any kind of company. Now, unfortunately, we usually only see the value of governance when companies fail or when the governance fails. I think you nicely pointed to Wirecard, which is a great example of that. we have Theranos, we have WeWork as other, recent examples, where actually when you looked back and tried to figure out what went wrong along the way of this, once very successful startups, it usually comes down to a imperfect governance system or an imperfect, binds to rules which have been set out, quite correctly at the start. Now, what I believe, or what I have been able to observe, at many startups, is that usually, entrepreneurs, startup teams, don't give a lot of attention to those governance topics, particularly at the beginning, as you have many other priorities to follow. But I would argue that, giving some thought right at the beginning of your company's existence, and putting the right systems, in particular the right people in place, can actually be a key success factor for your venture, your startup, to succeed.
Thank you, Michael. That was very helpful. Poini, coming to you, how can governance help startups in emerging markets like India? And do international governance standards apply to startups operating in such markets?
Yeah, I think, see, the same thing what Michael talks about, whether you are in emerging market or any other developed market, wherever you are, it is very, very important for startup. It sets a base on which you are going to grow. So it sets the base for culture, it sets the base for personal discipline, it sets the base for processes, it sets the base for the people to conduct themselves, clarity of role, communication vis-a-vis stakeholder. So whether you are in emerging market or whether you are in an established market, I think corporate governance is very, very important for startups. What happens is that, as Michael pointed out, in early stage, like founders, they're hustling too much to create their technology, develop their product, trying to keep the people together, so on and so forth, and they actually miss out certain discipline in day-to-day activity, taking control of their finance, putting the process in place, putting right communication within the team or beyond, beyond team to external world, be it your customer or be it your supplier or be it your eventually shareholder or whatever it is. And it is like, if you can't put up the things in place in early stage, undoing or managing during growth phase is becoming very, very chaotic process. And hence it is very important for startup to have the things upfront. I'll just give you one example here. If you are starting a venture wherever you are, and you are a team of 3 co-founders, but between the co-founders, your role clarity is not clear, your capital structure is not clear, your founders agreement is not in place, and if you get funded, and if there are disagreement with the founders will just walk out with the equity and your startup can fizzle out. Yeah. So starting from very beginning, founders coming together, putting the things in order, and then building the things from there on is extremely crucial. As an incubator, for us, even for incubation, forget about investment, for incubation, founders agreement is the first step to instill that discipline.
Thank you, Poini. So founders agreement, so that can be a part of the checklist for any startup. But then after that, after the founders have established that agreement and all of that is set up, what would be the next set of steps that any startup would have to do in order to implement an effective corporate governance system within their setup?
Yeah, so see, I see corporate governance on multiple fronts. It's a very broad topic, right? But what a startup has to pay attention to, your corporate governance towards people, towards stakeholder, that's communication, towards legal and compliance, and financial discipline. So all these 4 things are very important at a very beginning level. So you start your business activity on day-to-day basis. Do you have record of your spending or income or funding that has come to you? How are you spending? Are you communicating to your investors, even if it is like, friends, family? So 3 Fs that we call about, like founders, friends, and families. Yeah. So are you communicating to them what exactly you have spent the money for, what milestones you have achieved, where you were when you received the money, and where you are going after spending the money? So it starts from, like, at that point. So financial is very important. Regulatory compliance, you are in the first year or you are in third year, regulatory compliance is very important. Statutory dues, it's very important. Yeah. Your team, when you hire contracts with team, certain things very critical, like uh, not NDA, so non-disclosure agreement vis-a-vis your team, very important. Yeah. No compete clause, very important. Otherwise any key or an early employee can go out and they start doing the same thing that you are doing it. So these are the things really really important in early stage.
Thank you, Poini. So one of the key things that I think you guys mentioned is but also about setting up the board, right? And so now I think the next question is to Michael. So Michael, what is regarded as a well-constituted board, and what is the role of the board here vis-a-vis governance?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think the board, it's really my experience pivotal to good governance, because the board at the end, it's the link between the investors, who put up money, who put up, their connections, who put up, their belief in an idea, and the entrepreneur, who have a great idea, who know about a product, who are really very much driven to make it happen. And as Pony pointed out very correctly, at the beginning, usually everybody's very happy, everything goes fine. But as soon as you have to take some key decisions as to bring in new investors, as to enter a new market and so on, usually the interests diverge or can diverge quite quickly. And therefore, I think the board it's pivotal to establish a clear guidance, a clear kind of platform to make these key decisions in the interest of the company and not of any particular party, neither only the entrepreneurs nor only the investors. Now, when talking about the board, I always say, actually, you probably should look at 3 dimensions of a board. I think number one, and that's the very obvious one, it's the composition. So what kind of people you like to have join your board. And here, I think you should view a board of a startup not only as a control mechanism, as it might be in many very big established companies where it's usually a supervision body. But in a startup, you lack resources, you lack money, you lack expertise. So make sure you kind of fill the board as to the objective to have, all the different expertise, experience, and exposures, represent in the board, which you might not have or which you might lack in the entrepreneur's team. And I think this one can be, quite a good way, to fill some gaps by appointing people to the board who can exactly help you on a very specific needs, be it establishing some connections, be it having good exposure to a certain industry. Now, so that's the composition. And again, here also very important, in a startup company, the demands, the conditions can change very quickly. Hence, you might have some people joining a board for a couple of years, but then you might need to look for other ones. So it's quite a temporary assignment in a startup board. And actually, that's not bad. That's good. I think it's a good sign of the startup when they have some turnover in the board, kind of to make sure, the team, the board, actually always fits the requirements at a given point of time. Now, the second dimension, which I think is also very key in my view, it's, how does the collaboration work within the board, but as well between the board and the entrepreneur or the team, operating team of a company. And here again, I think, usually there's 3 roles which a board can fulfill. As said before, it's about help control what's going on. I think that's, that's you need to do, that's you're obliged to by law to make sure the board has full transparency what's going on. And if something goes wrong, it's the board is accountable for this, misbehavior or whatever, happens. The second one, again, I think very important for startups, it's what I would call the co-direction function of a board. So usually entrepreneurs might be people with less experience, and ideally you have in the board people who have, done something similar before, who have a lot of experience in a given industry, and they might be of great value in helping you to direct or define the direction of the company. And make use of that, make use of this power you can have on the board level. And then the third kind of, I would say, role of a board, it's the role of a coach. There's a lot of formal requirements you have to fulfill as a board, but there's a lot of emotional, ups and downs going on in any startup, as all of you who are involved in startups know this very well. And I would also say, the board can be of a great coach or a mentor, to an entrepreneur to help him or her to master kind of these ups and downs, very effectively. And then finally, the third dimension, I would say, and that's probably maybe the most important one in any board, it's the culture. So do you trust each other? Have you gone through difficult times? Can you rely on each other? And I would say eventually, finally, this is even more important than having all the rules and regulations and papers in place. Make sure, you get to use to each other, how each other works. And I think if you have established this trust basis, I think this usually is a pretty good precondition for effective governance in a startup.
Thank you, Michael. I think that was very helpful in understanding. So one thing that always I wonder is when should a board meet, and how often should they meet? Should it be a recurring meeting that the board should have, or should it be as and when the CEO or the startup needs them?
So I would say actually, might not, satisfy you both, I think, but I would very much differentiate between kind of the formal meetings of a board, which usually should take place, 5, 6 times a year. It very much depends a little bit on where you are with the startup. I think if you're in a very early stage, it makes sense to have more meetings. If you are more established, you probably need less formal meetings. So that's kind of the formal, meetings you have. I think that's comparable to any big companies, probably a bit more frequent than established companies. But I think what's even more important, to have also kind of informal meetings. And in informal meetings, you might take up certain topics which are very high on the agenda of the board member or of, the entrepreneur. And these actually are the opportunities where you can, take up issues informally, where you can actually provide personal advice, recommendations. But again, make sure you kind of separate, these informal meetings, which also could be just a call, a weekly call, or, you spend a weekend together and go through kind of, the nitty-gritty of a contract or a business plan, but really differentiate and distinguish these informal interactions with formal ones where you really have to stick, to the minutes, where you have to make sure you fulfill all kind of, obligations you have from a legal point of view, and keep these as well quite formal to make sure you don't miss any important point.
So Archit, I can add
Yes,
here
please.
Indian perspective. So
Please.
like for us, like minimum meeting requirement is actually governed by regulation. So at least once a quarter board has to meet, and that gap between two meetings typically cannot be more than 3 months. So again, like, you cannot have one meeting in January and one meeting in June. Yeah. So that time duration also has to be maintained. I would also like to take up where Michael spoke about like the formal and informal meeting and what kind of board you need to have. At times what happens, at least in Indian context, it is very difficult to get very senior people, established people, because under Indian corporate law, personal liability of board is very high for any kind of non-compliances. So experienced people like that you ideally would like to have them on board, they generally don't want to come on the board of the startup. So separate, two layer. One is statutory board where you have minimum set of people. Yeah. And out there you can comply with your regulatory requirement. But you have this board member as an advisory board member. And with their advisory board member, you can have all kind of discussions related to business advisory, compliance related aspect, input from them. Also, like, when you have difficult time, you can always touch base with them, like, and formal, informal discussion that, like, add value to your venture. So it is possible to segregate statutory board and like advisory board if it is too difficult to invite, uh, really experienced people on your board who are not really willing to undertake, many liability. So this is what, like, I wanted to add from Indian perspective.
Thank you, Punya. Actually, that's actually very helpful to have two kinds of boards, one as an advisory, one for statutory requirements. But in that setup, what is the role of the chair of the board? And and should there be a separation of responsibilities between the CEO of the startup or the company and the chair of the board?
So CEO, Michael, can I take it or you would like to say?
Please go ahead.
Okay. So CEO is actually in charge of day-to-day operation of the company, right? So many times, like, CEO is also a chairman and all those things. That's not the best way to go about it. It's good to separate. Yeah. So CEO is in charge of day-to-day activity, functional, responsible for business goals, achieving objective, and managing, team and organizational responsibility. Uh, Chairman provides, so board provides actually strategic advisory guidance to a venture. Yeah. And typically CEO works under the direction of this board. And therefore, chairman with non-executive responsibility and CEO with executive responsibility, both sitting on the board, is the ideal combination.
Thank you. Michael, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, probably just bring in probably the European or the Swiss perspective in that. So on the one hand, I think it's on the legal side. Let's first start with the legal side. So legally speaking, everybody on the board of directors is accountable for board decisions. So you can't kind of just delegate it to the chairman and make him accountable if something goes wrong. Everybody is accountable. Now, on the Swiss law, the chairman has some special, rights, so he can have access to data and information of the company. He needs to kind of organize the meetings and make sure everything is on track and so on. But I think legally speaking, on the accountability side, the whole board is accountable for whatever it's being decided in the board. Now, on a more, I would say, managerial level, what I've seen, observed many times, one of the key success factors of, I would say, effective versus ineffective governance, it's usually the relationship between the CEO, which very often is the founder, the entrepreneur, and the chairman. And if this works well, if they have a trustworthy relationship, if they complement each other nicely, where actually both listen to each other and take each other's advice seriously, this can work extremely well. But I think as soon as you have kind of conflicts or different viewpoints, different values between these two key people in governance, then usually the problems start to occur, and it actually can end pretty badly if you can solve this interpersonal kind of issue. So therefore, I would say yes, it's very important to have the right people, in particular in these two spots, the CEO and the chairman. And I fully agree with Pony. I think yes, at the beginning it's the same person. If you have a very small company, you are everything in one person. But I would definitely recommend entrepreneurs, if they grow the business, look for a very effective complementary chairman who can really add value and also challenge you. Because as an entrepreneur, as we all know, we are very self-convinced of what we're doing. We really believe that's the next big thing. That's what you're doing is totally right and in the right direction. And we might not always be very open to outside advice. So be open, listen to the chairman, and don't take it as criticism, but take it as constructive help and support to make sure kind of your startup, moves in the right direction.
Thank you, Michael. That's interesting as well. So do you think that there is value in having an independent director in the board? And if so, what value can an independent director add in this setup?
Yes. So Michael, you want to go ahead? Otherwise, I can take it up.
Yeah, please take it.
Okay. So, when it comes to board, especially in initial stage and also during growth stage, typically you also have representation from each stakeholder. So, like, founders are sitting on the board, your investors are sitting on the board. There could be strategic partner who is sitting on the board, and each represent their respective area of activity, right? Independent, and sometimes it get into conflict also, right? So independent director actually tries to bring this balance across all stakeholder, also without without any conflicting. He or she brings a very very fresh perspective on a situation or on case to case basis, any business matter or very very strategic matter or so and so forth. So in like Indian corporate system, at certain level for all listed publicly listed company, it is must to have an independent director.
Michael, are there any differences when we look at it from an European perspective?
Yeah, or even say within Europe, we have very different approaches. So you have in some countries, take the UK, for instance, you have kind of, NED and the, independent directors is kind of a legally required position, which means you need to select people to the board who have no direct, relationships or are not involved in daily activity, I think, versus the executive, board members. So it's a distinction, executive versus independent board members. Now, if you take the Swiss context again, we don't have this distinction. So in Switzerland, usually the board is separated from the management team. You might have the CEO as well being a board member, but then actually he has a different role. So he's kind of a delegate to the board. So he has a different role in the board and actually he plays as a CEO of a company, even if it's a small one. Now, when it comes to independence, I'm fully with Pony. I think it's extremely important to have this independence, be it, legally required or being just de facto independent in the board, in particular for startups, because in startups you have a lot of different interests which actually can easily collide. So take the WeWork case, I think, which has been broadly reported in the media the last couple of months, where you had a huge conflict in the board, around December, a couple of months, half a year ago, where you had SoftBank as one investor, you had some other investment funds, both having seats in the board, and they had very different perspectives and viewpoints what should happen now with WeWork. And then you even had the founder there as well, who again had a very different direction he wanted to take the company. And it ended up, in the court, I think, still going on. There's still court cases being carried out. And as you can imagine, if you end up at this situation, it's not good for a company. If you fight in court, I think more or less the company is gone at this early stage. Now, I just would like to point to another, element of the independence. I think that's sometimes quite a difficult one. It's a trade-off because on the one hand, you look for, people who are independent, and this means independent from the startup, so they don't have any role in the startup or any interests, but also independent, say financial independence. So they can afford to leave the board if they don't agree anymore with decisions taken. So they can independently speak out in the board. Now that's great, but again, not everybody, fulfills this condition, and it's sometimes very difficult to find those kind of people who have the luxury of being fully independent. On the other hand, I think that's a little bit sometimes the dilemma for selecting board members. You also want to have people who are very well connected, who know everybody, who can open doors for you, who might sit on 10 other boards. They're very well networked. So you have a little bit this issue, dilemma between independence and I call it interdependence. And again, it does not exclude each other, but actually sometimes it can actually cause you as a board member as well. There might be some conflict of interest, and you have to be very aware of that and make sure you take the right decisions, and even sometimes probably step down from a board if you say that this independence does not work out anymore.
Thank you. And so now that we're talking about independent directors, one question that comes to my mind is, how do we trust the independent directors with confidential information, especially since we know that they would probably leave in like a year or two, like as you mentioned, and all the directors are serving a tenure, and at the end of the tenure they leave. How do we feel comfortable sharing confidential information about our IP, about our market, everything with these directors?
If I probably just continue on what I said before, I think to me, the key condition of a successful board is this trust, having a trust established between the board members and the entrepreneur. And therefore, you can sign NDAs, you can take somebody to court, if somebody breaches your agreement and so on. But I would say if that happens, then you have done something wrong in actually assessing or validating, your board members. And I think what I've seen, which works pretty well, to make sure you can trust each other, that you, for example, start, not right away as a board member, but you might just start as an advisor, as Pony pointed out before, it might be advisory board, might be just a consultant, or just sitting in board meetings, and try to build this trust between all people involved. And then if everybody believes, both sides believe, now we have a very trustworthy relationship. Now then you might want to take a board seat, and then I think you have already proven the case that there's trust in between. But again, it's not an insurance against every issue or every conflict. But this has been my experience, really try to select the right people and, put trust, as a key value in any such relationships.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mike.
I think the credentials of board has to be assessed very clearly. It would be good that, if you trust any stakeholder and that stakeholder give a reference and get those people also invited. It's very important. It's unavoidable because you are not going to ask them to sign NDA. A requirement of the board, you are supposed to submit all the information with the board and all those stuff. So it's a purely trust, personal credentials, a reputation of the person. Otherwise, even in a large corporate, we have seen that things have gone even insider trading and all those things has happened. So it's not a issue specific to startup. It's issue general issue of trust and personal credentials. Yeah?
Right. Thank you, Poini. So now let's move on to the next topic within the governance section. Thank you, Govind. So now let's look at it from an investor perspective. Right now, investors are actually looking at governance or the governance procedures that the startups have set up in any startup that they are looking to invest. So what governance issues do investors look at when they are investing in a startup? Poini, let's start with you, taking India's perspective, please.
So, see, whenever I see any company getting approached by investors, or when there is a term sheet is already signed, the due diligence are typically happening on three fronts. Apart from business, market, and all those things, that's not a corporate governance issue. But one is legal due diligence, legal compliance and financial due diligence. What do I mean by legal? Whether your contracts are in place, contracts with team, contracts with founders, contract with your vendors, contract with your clients, all those things are properly in place or not. Because someone is putting money based on certain customer pipeline that you have, and contract with that customer is not there for your solution or product, then how do you trust that what you are talking about is going to be the revenue going forward? Yeah. So it's basically legal compliances. Second thing is that financial compliances, whether your books are in order, how is your P&L is looking like, how is your income expenditure is looking like, how is your cash flow is looking like, what is the accounting practice that you have adopted, what kind of auditor's note in your accounts are there. Yeah. So financial, plus you what kind of borrowing you have taken, whether it is recorded or not. Personal contribution, founders contribution in initial stage, they put in money but they don't record. Yeah, is it recorded or not? So financial records, that is another thing. Records as well as financial practices. Yeah, Uh, and then various authorization for various financial aspects and all those stuff. And third thing is regulatory, statutory compliances. So these are the three main things that they look at. When I say statutory compliances, starting with paying statutory dues like service tax or goods tax or employee tax or whatever, to an income tax, whether you got your proper registration in place or not, whether your board minutes are recorded or not. Yeah, everything comes under compliance issue, whether you have submitted your annual report with the regulator or not. So these are the things, main three things: legal, compliance, financial. These are the aspects that investors look at, especially in early stage. Of course, going forward, there's always a history is built up, and then eventually startups start building up. But in early stage, also they pay attention to this.
Thank you, Poini. So, Michael, do Swiss investors also have similar setups, or do they follow the same diktats that the markets in India are asking for, the legal, financial, regulatory compliances?
Right. I think you probably would have very similar kind of checklist when it comes to DD as due diligence, where you definitely will look at all these elements, which pretty nicely pointed out. This is definitely usually part of a due diligence. It depends a little bit on the stage of the startup, whether actually you would expect to have all the contracts already in place, or whether you would be a little bit more flexible in terms of that they can close all these gaps probably at a later stage. So that's a little bit much depends, and don't do it at the beginning. But I think at the end, in particular when it comes to a Series A and B, yes, that's definitely what you want to have right and have checked. Now, what I've seen, and that's quite interesting, also kind of a change in how actual investors look at those aspects. And actually, the change probably has come based on two developments. On the one hand, we are now in a quite mature stage of this current, I would say, innovation or startup boom. At the beginning, probably people were a little bit more, flexible, less strict on all these rules and DD lists and so on, and checklists. But now, in particular, with all these scandals coming up almost in a weekly basis, I think investors definitely get much more worried and ask many more questions. And therefore, I think we'll see, in my expectation, even a stronger emphasis on those elements, on compliance, but governance on top. Then I think the second trend, which you're also seeing, I think that's not only in startups but across all the companies, where investors put much more emphasis on governance. You might have heard about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. As one of the criteria, investors ask many more questions to established companies. And again, I expect as well this trend to come to the world of startups as well. It's already here, but I think it will become even more eminent. And these two trends, late stage of an innovation cycle and the overall ESG trend in the investor community, I think combined, in my view, will definitely put much more emphasis, in the years to come, on this governance questions and checklists and indices, which investors will bring forward.
Thank you, Michael. I think that perfectly fits into our next category as well. That's related to disclosure issues. So thank you, Govind, again. So now disclosure and transparency, right, may harm a startup's competitive position in the market. We are talking about, disclosing a lot of these informations that may be the strengths of that startup. So why should they disclose more information, or is it in any way harmful to the startup? Michael?
Okay, sure. Now, and I think to me, we need to distinguish between what kind of information you disclose. I think on one hand, you have the product information, you have the market data, your consumer data, and this one, it's definitely, that's usually your key or IPs you have. And I think, very clear, this one, you should not disclose unless there's some, data regulation which requires to disclose it. But otherwise, I think it's fully understood, I think, by any company and even the regulator, that there are, property information which actually make a company competitive or less competitive. But sometimes what I've seen that, some companies misuse this notion of competitive information to hide, governance information. So for instance, very simple information, your board members, do they have, what kind of stakes do they have in your companies? Do they have stake in any competing companies? Might have even invested in some companies you want to acquire, kind of all these, insider issues. On the other hand, as well, the entrepreneur, what kind of stakes he or she has, what kind of agreements he or she has with banks. Again, we have seen that with Wirecard and any other scandals, when all this breaks and the bubble, collapses, all these quite strange agreements come to light, which, you ask yourself, why didn't anybody ask this before? Or why didn't they disclose these agreements, before it happened? And there, I think there's no excuse, with competition or property information. This is just kind of, people trying to hide some information, which actually the board probably would not approve if they knew about it. So I think make sure you really distinguish between legitimate, private or corporate information and, illegitimate misuse of hiding key governance data and information.
Thank you, Michael. So Poini, do we have similar challenges here in India as well, or do we face some other kinds of disclosure issues or conundrums that we run into?
No. So I think we do have challenges of, startup or founders are not always disclosing all the information in the guise of like it could affect my market and competitive position. But I have a different view here. I think when you invite people on your board, they are your own stakeholder here. Yeah. And as Michael said, that it's a question of trust. Yeah. If you know them, you have invited them, they are working with you statutorily, you are supposed to submit certain information. I think out there cannot be an excuse about, it is disclosing information to my immediate stakeholder is going to impact my competitive position. That cannot be an excuse, and you have to do that. There are issues out there, if you look at it, the biggest corporate governance issue, if Indian audience can relate to any, is housing.com. There was a conflict between founders and board members on ideas, on information submission and all those things, and a very beautiful company collapsed.
Okay, so that's actually very helpful as well. So thank you. The next, so far we talked about, building these processes, procedures. We talked about, setting up the board. Now, all of these in a way adds, cost, a monetary cost to any startup, right? And for any kind of startup, I think it's very easy to say cash is king. It's all about the runway. They don't really see anything outside of the runway. Everything that we talked about, the non-negotiable priorities, are about elongating that runway. So is adding governance processes and procedures reduce that runway? So what is there a cost that comes to it, or is there a benefit also that supports it or it elongates it? Michael, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very fair point, because I would also say that's probably the biggest hurdle why startups usually don't really embrace governance, because it might affect their cash run and might seen as not opportune in a short term. Now, what I usually say to startups is, don't look at it at cost, but look at it as an investment. You would also kind of invest in your brand, you would invest in new technology, and if you really believe in your product, in your startup, you will also be around in 5-10 years, if you are successful, and it will definitely pay off. Probably not in year one, most likely, but actually pay off at some point in the future. And the earlier you start, actually, the less you have to invest. So, in particular, if you put all the emphasis on the culture, trust, on the values early on in your process of your setting up your startup, this will pay off heavily. Not only that the risk of that you fail will be lower, but if you succeed, you will have a much more sustainable organization, and you will run into much fewer problems later on. Again, here we have many cases as well. famous one, Uber case, where they definitely did not really invest in setting up the right culture at the beginning of Uber, and the price was heavy. Was heavy for the founder who had to leave the board. Was heavy as well for many employees who were sacked later on because the company ran into problems because of a cultural issue. Even if you take Facebook or some other companies, they actually, you could argue, they probably did not invest early enough in the culture, and as a result, have now to pay a very, very high price to catch up and kind of, correct what has gone wrong early in their development.
Yeah. So I agree with Michael, Arjit. In fact, I look at this way, that this compliances issue or certain corporate governance issue have two aspects. One is personal discipline. There's no cost there. Yeah. Another is that compliances. Yeah. On compliances, I would say that non-compliance will carry a larger cost in going forward than paying money to be compliant upfront. Yeah. So more than investment, the thing is that cost for non-compliance is also very, very heavy. So you don't want to basically, end up paying for non-complying rather than you be upfront compliant here.
Thank you, Poini and Michael, for sharing your insights into the importance of governance for startups. Now, we do see that as we were talking and discussing these things, there were quite a few questions that got posted on our Q&A. So let's also target those for now. The first one is specifically focusing on the board meetings. Now, should every meeting be formalized and documented? Michael, let's start with you for this one, please.
Yes, I think think that's even legally obliged. I think there's one very important topic here to address. On the one hand, make very precise minutes. I think that's what I always recommend boards, and when I'm in board as well, I make sure this happens. And it's not just that you have all decisions being documented, but actually if something goes wrong later on, you actually can prove that you have given due thoughts, diligence to any of these decisions. Because again, if something goes wrong and they take you to court, you have to prove that you have taken all information available into account to come to a conclusion. If you can't prove it, it's your problem. So make sure all decisions are really taken, the minutes are really taken very carefully.
Thank you, Michael. Poini, do we have any regulatory compliance reasons why we have to document board meetings here?
Yeah, all meetings. I think whatever Michael spoke about, this is exactly applicable to even Indian system.
Thank you. The next question is, as an aspiring entrepreneur, if you are now setting up your company, and at what stage is the board needed, and is that different for the type of organization that you're trying to form between a limited liability partnership versus a private limited? Does the role of the board or the setup of the board time changes? Poini?
Yeah, sure. So I think the limited liability has a different requirement, and so they are partners, and partners are supposed to take this forward. Under Companies Act, you are supposed to have a board. Again, if you look at what we spoke for last 45 minutes, the relevance of board is actually beyond compliances, right? You need board for help you get started, put certain, give you strategic direction, put certain disciplines, put certain basically, compliances related aspect, give you lots of business and other advisory. So it is always good to have a board. Now, you call it as a board of governance and as a statutory requirement, or you call it as a advisory board. This is a need for a startup. So you should have good board as early as possible in your venture cycle.
Thank you, Poini. Michael, I think this question is for you. So while getting a valuation done for a potential buyer or an investor, is it better to do an exclusive due diligence or not?
Yeah, I think this has a lot to do with these tactics, in the kind of optimizing your valuation. Usually, I would recommend not to go for exclusivity very early on. Sometimes, investors always want to have it. I think it's a little bit a question of bargaining power. But I would also recommend make sure you can keep kind of parallel processes running as long as possible to avoid to get too dependent, for one investor. But as a matter of fact, at some point, yes, you have to give exclusivity. At some point of time, it also makes sense, kind of to put trust in one investor. But again, here also think a senior board member who has a lot of experience in transactions, in M&As, can be of great help to give exactly this, these hints and tricks of how to play the game. Because at the end, it's a game you play, between investors and the entrepreneur.
Thank you, Michael. So Poini, do we have any templates or frameworks for governance structures, or are there any best practices that we can emulate, or any other resources that you could recommend us or direct us to for this? Poini, I think you're speaking on mute.
Yeah. See, corporate governance, some of the aspect actually flows from various legal requirement. So there are like requirement already documented, and some of the aspects are like, what organizational culture that you have to build going forward. Yeah. There's no template around it, but I think like getting a senior entrepreneur, talking to senior entrepreneur or talking to senior industry people will help you put the process in place. So there's no template, but if you read, I'm sure there would be dozens of documents you may come across.
Thank you, Poini. Michael, how many board members should a startup have? And is the size of the board dependent on the size of the startup in any way?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's no magic formula here, as you can imagine. But I think there are some rule of thumb or some observation you can make. So first of all, I would also recommend have an odd number of board members, not an uneven number of board members. So if there's any kind of you come in the situation where you have to vote on anything, you can actually have a clear result of the vote. Second rule of thumb, I would say, make it not too big, because at the end, the board should be a forum where you can discuss, where you can debate, where everybody needs to be heard if she or he has a point to raise. And I would say in an ideal case, 5, 7, I think this probably would be number of board members, actually for any type of companies, I would say, which would be ideal, as long as it's possible, to have all the different, expertise, experience, and exposures you need among those 5 or 7 members of a board. Sometimes if you're in a very specific, business, you might need more people because you just need the expertise. Sometimes, particularly if you're in an early stage of your business, I would keep it very, very small, probably 3 members, that's totally sufficient. Otherwise, it gets too complicated. It gets actually too difficult even to find, meeting times or slots to meet. That's also something not to forget. So yes, it depends on the size. But again, I would recommend don't make it too big, try to get to 5 to 7 members. I think that's usually seems to be a good size.
Thank you, Michael. Poini, do we have any regulatory compliance limitations on the board size? No. I think you're on mute, Poini.
My bad. So we don't have this requirement. I agree with Michael. I think at a different stage you require different kind of board expertise as well as size of the board. In initial stage, when you are just beginning, you are not even funded, I think 3 people should be okay. The moment you get funded, it would be like it can go up to 4, 5, and then you grow, it can be even bigger. Sometimes even when you grow and you are closely listed, you are not a publicly listed company, you are a closed thing, you can also do with a minimal board if there are not enough conflicting issues are there. So you can actually too big board also basically is not very advisable. It brings in too much perspectives and too much viewpoints, too much conflict also. So it's in managing that board is also very difficult for founders in early stage. I agree with Michael's viewpoint that ideally it should have odd numbers so that, like, when there is a difference of opinion, there's one number which favors one particular side. So it's helpful to have an odd number.
Thank you. So one last question from Michael, and this is purely because we are running out of time. I want to make sure that we don't go beyond the time. I'm sure people have other things as well lined up. How much of the advisory board shares must a startup set aside? And how do we negotiate people asking too much shares for an advisory board position?
Yeah, I think that's a very key practical issues which many boards face. That some board members actually try to combine, a board seat with shares and try to negotiate it. Now, if that happens, I would actually be a little bit cautious. If somebody says, actually, I will only join your board if you give me X sums of shares, so make it conditional, it might not be the right board member. So he or she might not join for actually supporting the team, but might have some other interests in mind. On the other hand as well, if you have somebody who comes to the board and does not want to take shares and just wants to get compensated, that again, I would be a little bit worried, and this might be an indication, might be the wrong board member. So I think in general, I would really recommend to separate these two issues. There could be a deal where, board member gets some shares, that's fine, to save you some cash, that's fine. But, I would not make it conditional. Otherwise you might mix, or you have to then you might take the wrong decision, because you want to achieve two targets, two objectives, and you might actually pay too much for achieving it.
Thank you, Michael. All right, so I think we had a fantastic discussion with our panelists today. We touched a lot of things. There are a few questions I missed, so my apologies there. I tried to get to as many questions as I possibly can. I will definitely try to get those questions, those unanswered questions, answered through our panelists, and try to send them over to the requesters. I'll definitely try that. And one thing I do want to say is that please do not consider the discussion today to be the end all for everything about startup governance. What we hope is that the insightful discussion today provokes your thoughts and becomes a discussion starter in your respective circles. To close it, Govind, can we flip to the next slide, please? Thank you. So on behalf of Swissnex India, I would like to thank the speakers, first of all, for taking the time to join us for this webinar and sharing their thoughts. And thank you all for being here today, taking the time to patiently listen to what our speakers had to say. I would also like to thank Swissit sponsors who join hands with the Embassy of Switzerland in connecting Switzerland and India through innovation, entrepreneurship, and cultural leadership. Finally, please reach out to us on innovation@swissnexindia.org for any further questions or comments. Another webinar that we are conducting on 14th of July is on India's intellectual property outlook, and I'm sure there must be open questions that you might have for that. So please visit our LinkedIn page for more information on that, as well as upcoming programs and staying in touch. So on behalf of Swissnex India, I wish you all a blessed day. Goodbye.